Schools are closed, and everyone is talking about the virus. Children pick up on stress and may respond in different ways than adults. Love, attention, and routine can make them feel more secure. For more tips from Seattle Children's experts to support your family as you cope, live, and learn during COVID, follow Seattle Children's on Facebook or visit seattlechildrens.org. Schools are closed, and everyone is talking about the virus. Children pick up on stress and may respond in different ways than adults. Love, attention, and routine can make them feel more secure. For more tips from Seattle Children's experts to support your family as you cope, live, and learn during COVID, follow Seattle Children's on Facebook or visit seattlechildrens.org.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Parent Ed Talk, Collective Coping, Healing Racial Trauma in Community with Christine Tang. Christine Tang is the Executive Director of Families of Color Seattle, or FOCS, which is pronounced folks. It's our acronym short for that. It's an organization that is working hard to create space and meaningful community connections for families of color in the greater Seattle area. Christine has two young boys, and she is a Nigerian Romanian immigrant. And she herself found in folks the support and understanding she needed as a mother of children with intersectional identities. Christine is passionate about issues pertaining to intersectionality, environmental justice, racial equity, and inclusion in education. We're also really lucky to have with us today Deb Grover. She glows when she talks about the wonderful privilege she has had to be able to work with parents as they navigate the waters of parenthood and discover their inner calm. In addition to facilitating Finding Calm classes, Deb is the Marketing and Outreach Director of Community of Mindful Parenting. The Community of Mindful Parenting, which is the innovator behind Listening Mothers and Finding Calm parenting classes, aspires to empower parents to become more effective, mindful, and self-compassionate. Deb is a graduate of many mindful parenting programs, including MBSR, MSc, and the Science of Wellbeing from Yale University. She's a proud mother of two daughters, a lifelong learner, and a growing mindful parent. My name is Elaine Sulkin, and I am the publisher of ParentMap. For those of you not familiar, we are a content-rich resource assisting you on your parenting journey. We publish parenting books, one in particular called Getting to Calm, which really fits this moment. We also publish free news magazines. We also host an award-winning website, which we hope you'll check out, ParentMap.com, and produce dozens of live and now virtual events. We also hope you'll consider subscribing to ParentMap and getting it in your mailbox, 13 issues for $12. Before we begin, we just wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded for future educational or promotional use. You will get a link to it afterwards if you want to watch it or share it with friends. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A feature, and we really urge you to ask questions, anything that you think of along the way, and we will present that to Deb and Christine. We also couldn't do this without you zooming in, and just want to thank you taking the time, and we also really want to thank our sponsors. Seattle Children's Hospital as our presenting sponsor, and also Pacific Medical Centers, Seattle Jewish Community School, Leg Up, Sleeping Lady Resort, Sunshine Music Together. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Deb Grover and Christina Tang. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks for this opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Hi, Christine. Nice to see you. Can we just kick this off with Christine? Just give us kind of the elevator pitch overview of the mission and purpose of Families of Color Seattle.
Good morning, Deb and Elaine, and good morning to all of you who have checked in today. Families of Color Seattle was established as an informal group of parents about 7-8 years ago. And since then, it has grown into a community-based nonprofit that is here to support families of color. And those are families who are raising children of color in the Seattle area. It was born out of a desire to connect with other parents who had children of color and make sure that our children had the right resources and the right materials like books, and the parents had the right tools to be able to have conversations about race, racial identity with their children, and culture. And now we have a lot of parent groups that support parents at various ages of parenthood, from parents of newborns and toddlers to multi-age affinity groups. And we also do advocacy with community partners for racial equity, because our mission as an organization and our vision is for children of color to be in a world that is racially and economically just.
Wonderful. Sounds like just really important work, particularly right now. Let's kind of dive into some deeper questions here to help elaborate on that vision and that mission. What is the Family of Color's response to the latest murders and uprisings that are happening in our nation, and what is Families of Color Seattle doing about that?
Yes, unfortunately, our families of color, and especially the Black families, the Black parents in our community, have had to deal with this their entire lives. This is not new to us. It's newer to perhaps the rest of the country in that many people are understanding the scope and the depth of institutional racism and the discrimination that communities of color, and especially Black and Indigenous communities have dealt with all this time. And because of the prevalence of video footage that's can be spread through social media and other internet platforms, people are becoming more aware of it. So the way we've responded was to provide spaces for our parents to grieve, and also continue to provide our services online. Our service delivery model before COVID-19 was all in person for cohort-based parent groups, for gatherings around food, for festivals, and we had to shift right away when the stay-at-home order was implemented, so that we can continue to support our families online. We also made a decision as an organization that for as long as we can, we will provide all services free of charge. For us, it's also a social justice issue for our parents to be able to access all our parent groups, our services, our workshops online, our community spaces online, at no cost to them. We know that families of color, especially Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families, have been so disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and all the ensuing effects on job security and housing security. So we didn't want to add any burden for families to access our services. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to afford to offer all this for free, but for as long as we can, we will continue to do that. And we've had many generous families who were in the position to donate, so that also helped a lot to have some of our families donate to support these services. We're also providing COVID-19 relief for families who are at high risk for losing their housing, or might be losing their home. Those families who have been affected by job loss or are at high risk for that. For families affected by disability. So all these added layers of marginalization that some of our families are suffering, we wanted to contribute and help them throughout these hard times. So we're providing some COVID-19 related relief in the form of gift certificate to grocery stores, so that at least our families can provide food and essentials to their children. And last but not least, so I mentioned that we do continue to provide the parent support group, the cohort-based models online. We also have what we call virtual programs, and those are recurring weekly and also one-off type of programs where families can gather and discuss issues related to parenting during COVID, because it's so different when you have the little ones at home and you might also have to work full time at the same time you're supposed to also homeschool your kids. We have mindfulness workshops, and we also have, especially after the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing uprisings, we've had community spaces online for people to process and just be in those grieving circles.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I would imagine in these classes and in these support groups, there's lots of conversation about all of this regarding how, like, recommendations to parents. You know, a parent is coming to you probably feeling some sense of overwhelm, like you said, trying to have conversations about race, trying to have conversations about health, trying to have conversations about, you know, mom and dad are online working, and how do they keep themselves, how do the children keep themselves entertained or safe? How do you recommend parents talk about, how do you recommend parents go about doing this? Do you have some tips that are coming out of your workshops and classes?
Yes, for families of color, so folks defines those families of color, those children, those families who have children of color. That means the parents can be Black or POC, or they can be mixed race couples, or they can be single parents, and there can also be white parents who are parenting children of color through adoption or foster care. So I think for those of us who are Black or POC, I think many of us have had these discussions with children about race and racial identity and our place in the world and the cultural heritage that our children have. So for me, at least personally, has been like having these conversations about what's happening right now with my children has been was a more natural conversation because we already had that foundation. So we've had many conversations about race and about civil rights, and some they've learned in school, and some was done at home. So having had those conversations with my 5-year-old and 7-year-old about racism, they already had that foundation when we talked about George Floyd and what happened to him, and how he was murdered, and how other Black people were unnecessarily killed by police, or unnecessarily brutalized, or how they're discriminated against, even though it's 2020. And they might learn from school that all that ended with the 1960s and Dr. Martin Luther King. But my kids know that's not quite the truth. That's not true. So we have had those conversations, and it wasn't easy. And I did have my own doubts as a parent, like how much should they know, how much to tell them. And I just follow their lead, answer their questions, and I feel comfortable now that they know exactly what they need to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you said your boys are 5 and 7?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're just starting to have some exposure to this. I'm thinking about families that have younger children and older children, starting with those that have younger children.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be able to comprehend these kind of big concepts, but they certainly can pick up on their parents' or siblings' anxieties and stressors that are going on. What thoughts or recommendations do you have for families with younger children?
Yeah, I think children can receive more information and understand more than we give them credit for. Mm-hmm. And I think having honest conversations with our children in age-appropriate ways is always beneficial. And that applies to conversations about race, that applies to conversations about sex and sexual abuse and the autonomy of their own bodies. And I encourage parents to start early. Research shows that children notice racial differences very early, as as babies. And by the time they get to preschool, if they're not explicitly taught otherwise, they on their own start assigning meaning to those differences. And the meaning they assign to racial differences is based on what messages their environment, the society, the books, the shows, everything that surrounds them, those messages that they receive. So if they walk around through the world and then they notice that, you know, the people their family holds in high regard are always white or tend to be male, and the people who are doing certain kind of work, not that it's any less useful to the society, but it is less paid and held in less regard. If those people have darker skin as the norm, then that's the meaning they're going to assign to race. And especially when you look at the books that children read and the innocuous messages that are possibly inadvertently included in children's books, and the lack of representation, and the fact that so few books have children of color as the central characters. All those things really made me realize as a parent that I have to be very intentional about the messages my children receive. And I can give you an example. I had a conversation with my 7-year-old who's really into science and biology and chemistry and all that. And we had a conversation about an example that may seem innocuous, but that continues to be in many books for children and adults. And that was the evolution picture, right? You have the evolution of man, right? Because it's not the evolution of humans, it's the evolution of man. And we as a race, as the human race, have evolved from apes into European men. And I showed him that as an example, and he said maybe what many adults might say, especially those who are not that familiar with institutional racism, is that, but that's just one. How do you know that was on purpose? And I said, well, let's look at others. And I did a Google search for that evolution pictures, and every single one that we found was, apes evolving into an European appearing men. And that I think was an aha moment for him. And it was a good way for me to explain those kind of messages that you might not think are a big deal, but because they're always included in that way, kind of defining human as European, right? And having those Eurocentric images over and over in children's books and the books that they learn from does send a certain message to our children, and that is that they are others. They're not the norm. And for children of color, for many children of color who do not have enough representation in the world surrounding them, that can be very confusing because they look in the mirror and they can't reconcile the image that they see in the mirror with the way they think of themselves, because all the images surrounding them, and then especially for the children who grow up in predominantly white environments, there's this there's this difference between the way they see themselves in the mirror and the way they perceive themselves to look like. So they're children of color who are very young, and if you ask them to point to a character in the book that looks like them, they will point to the white character because that's what they see as representative of children.
Wow. Interesting. That's quite a powerful image you were able to paint for your son there with the evolution picture. What would you tell a parent who's trying to have similar conversations? Like, is there like a bank of resources they can go to begin those conversations, or show what's happening, like you did so gracefully with your son?
Absolutely. We have a list of resources on our webpage, which is focseattle.org. And that list of resources is by no means exhaustive, but it's what we consider to be really good resources to discuss race, racial identity, and even the most recent, in the light of most recent events, racialized violence with children as young as preschool. So I definitely recommend that people go and check out that list of resources. We also welcome them to sign up for our newsletter. So anyone in the community can be on our newsletter list, and we send every month not only updates about our organization, but also what we consider to be useful resources for parents who are having these discussions. My advice would be to start early. If you're wondering if it's too early to have those conversations, believe me, it is not, and it can be done in age-appropriate ways. I would say one thing that I'm noticing is that there's already been quite a shift in children's publishing, even compared to 5 years ago when I was looking for books for my children. There are more books these days, not enough, but there's still more than there were 5 years ago. A lot more books that have children of color as narrators or as central characters of the book, often portrayed in a positive light, and there are more books published by authors of color. So I would recommend making sure that those books are in your bookcase. Do a media audit of what you have in the home, and do you have books that have children of color as characters, and not just about Dr. Martin Luther King, which is also great to have those books about freedom fighters, but also books where children of color are normalized and they just get to be the superheroes of their stories, right? And they get to, fly to the moon, and they get to do things that all children get to do, which is be the superheroes of their own stories.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Those culturally responsive books are so important, and we'd love to see more of those in our schools and libraries. I have the same question, but on the other end of the age, teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
They're having, with social media and their peer groups, more and more access to unfiltered information. They're seeing all sorts of things. What are your recommendations for parents of teenagers as they navigate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm so glad that you asked that. I think for when you have conversations with teenagers, as a parent, you yourself have to be well informed, because as I'm sure parents of teenagers already know, they will challenge you, and they will talk back, and they will challenge you, and you as a parent have to be informed enough to be able to answer in a way that your teenager will respect, but also in a way that's conclusively informed. So oftentimes what we recommend for parents of teenagers is to first of all, to, of course, inform and educate themselves. And there are lots of books and, the documentary 13 and so many books written for adults. For parents who are more at the beginning of this journey, I recommend So You Can Talk About Race by Joma Olu, who's a local writer. And then having these conversations with your children, and also do a media audit. Like, I know that the teenagers might not like it, but as a parent, you do have that ability to be informed about what your teenagers are watching, what's on their social media, and proceed from there. For teenagers and even preteens, it can be a really dangerous place to be online right now. Mm-hmm. A lot of teens, primarily white, but not only, are being recruited, like actively recruited in neo-Nazi groups, in quote unquote male rights groups online that are specifically chauvinistic and racist. And these kids are recruited with what seems to be at the beginning really innocuous, humorous memes and jokes, and then from there it just kind of desensitizes them to the point where they become active members in these online groups. So of course, what we recommend is having those discussions and making very clear where the family stands and why, and be able to substantiate that with, with actual real stories and personal stories and your friends' stories, your Black friends' stories and your friends of color, and data. And hopefully that will happen before your kids are at the age to be recruited by white supremacists online. I also recommend, this is a really great book for teens and preteens. This book is Anti-Racist, and I love the style it's written. It's very, you can't really see it that well, but the formatting is very appealing, I think, for children of that age.
That's really good to know. Yeah, I think I have 2 teenage daughters, and we've had, I think, part of the benefit of being at stay-at-home order together. We've had some really fantastic, difficult, uncomfortable conversations. I think we also, our kids are smart and they're sponges, and they want to understand and they want to learn and they want to practice their allyship. And it's a really important time to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah, and it's not just one conversation. It's that's one thing that we also recommend to parents, is don't think of it as like, oh, this big thing that I have to schedule and I have to make sure that there's time for it. It's the right time. It's pieces of conversation that you can really incorporate in other everyday conversation. Is talking about the news, is talking about what happened in the community that has to do with racism or racialized violence. Yeah, and not avoiding those difficult topics, because oftentimes the parents are avoiding them because of their own discomfort with the topic, or because they're not quite sure how to approach it with their children. And the thing is that once you put it on the table and you start having those conversations, you realize that it's really not that hard.
Yeah, we learned a lot about our children in that way too. One of the things that's coming up in my house, how do you think white community members should, quote unquote, check in on their Black and brown neighbors and families of color thoughtfully? How can this be done without coming across tone deaf or inadvertently offending? I think there's a lot of worry about that when the intention is support, but there's risk there of being inadvertently offensive.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say, especially for those who have deeper friendships with Black and brown families, your friends. So everyone, people might feel differently on this issue, because people are individuals. But I can tell you what my recommendations are based on my personal preferences and based on what I've heard from other Black and POC parents so far. My first recommendation is to, if there's, I'm hoping there's not going to be another murder like George Floyd's, but when things like this do happen, and I say when, because we know they kept happening even after George Floyd was murdered, and even though we hope there's going to be an end soon, I don't see that happening that soon. So when this happened, for those families, for those parents who are who were kind enough to check on their Black friends and other friends of colors, to do it with kindness and concern, not in a way that says, I'm doing this because George Floyd died, what do you think about it, or how are you feeling? Because that puts the burden on that friend to respond and they may not be in that headspace. So the kindness check-in, in my opinion, is one that does not require a reply. So it's not in the form of a question. It's not in a way that burdens the recipient. Just, I'm thinking about you. This is horrific. And I'm just thinking about you. And if you have an offering, you can propose the offering. Of course, it depends on the level of friendship and what you as a person can do. And I know that some people appreciated having food delivery ordered. It was just one less thing that they had to do, or something for the kids. A white friend of mine, for instance, dropped off flowers from her garden because my birthday was the week that George Floyd died, and she knew that I was in no mood to celebrate, but she wanted me to know that she had thought of me, and that did mean a lot. So that would be my recommendation. Do not ask them how they feel. Just assume that whatever you're feeling, for them, it's magnified to the power of 10. And I mean, in no way, please do not ask them to educate you on current events or question whether such incident was really about race, or in any way that puts the onus on them to answer. Because even if to you it's not about race, you know, if white people do not live through if they do not live the life through the eyes of people of color, it's the only way they can understand it is by believing and respecting the experiences of Black people and people of color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're saying, I've heard this many times, don't ask specifics, don't ask for a why. Just to, like you said, just offering kindness that can just be received.
Yeah, and I would also add, because I know, you know, there have been various posts about this, and people are, you know, when they're not quite sure what to say, they default to silence, and I think that's the worst. For me, that's like silence from friends just because they don't know what to say. It's painful, and of course I'm talking about the close friends. I'm not talking about every acquaintance in my phone book. And it doesn't have to be, you know, direct phone calls either. I know that people feel various ways about posting things on social media, but when I do see, you know, white friends on Facebook post about things that they're outraged, whether it's animal rights or you know, things like that, and then there's complete silence about George Floyd or Philando Castile, or things that have to do with the actual lives of Black people in this country, I can't help but interpret that a certain way.
So what I hear you saying is offer up kindness to your Black and brown friends and neighbors, but then go and do your own research, do your own homework, and self-educate, so that you can have a voice and you can help amplify the voices of others. How can white people practicing this allyship be these agents of change to undo racism, whether it be their own voice and using their platforms, or in their way that they're parenting their children, and teaching these future generations to be those allies?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think allyship is so important, and showing up in the right supporting ways and supportive ways is very important. I recommend for white people who want to support to get engaged with the Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites right away, because they are, you know, they're there to provide resources, like very specific resources and steps for white people, and how they can support how they can support racial justice. We, you know, as folks supporting families of color, we are here to provide services for any family that has children of color. And we've gotten some messages, from white people who have white kids saying, what about us? We want to be part of conversation, and we do want them to be part of conversation. It's a matter of being in the right group for that conversation, and affinity-based conversation groups are so important. I've been in several spaces where, we're ready to have conversations about racial equity and racial justice and next steps. And then there's so much time spent with someone who's brand new to the conversation and taking a lot of time and space just to be educated on the basics. It's like, I don't know, let's think of a metaphor. It's like being in 5th grade and ready to go to middle school, and then there's this kindergartner who's right there with you, and like, you can't go to middle school because you have to teach this kindergartner letters and sounding words out loud and sight words. So there's definitely a space for that, but it's holding back efforts towards actual effective social justice solutions if everyone is having. If everyone's the same discussion, the discussion has to default to the basics all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's why we recommend the Coalition for Anti-Racist White, because they do have the right resources and the right processes for that. Also, for those listening, I assume that all, or at least most of them, are parents, and one of the most important things you can do as a parent is anti-racist parenting. You are the most important person in your life to your child. So we know that mainstream America liked to think of racism as a thing of the past, and until recently, colorblindness was the preferred way to, quote unquote, deal or not deal with racism, because the American society thought that racism is dying out. And they're just waiting for, I guess, older racist white people to die out. That was not an effective solution to racism, and it was a rude awakening to many to see youth in Charlottesville with tiki torches chanting racist slogans. As I mentioned, neo-Nazis are actively recruiting school-age children to join their groups online. And just like any other important topics like sex or anything else that you want to be the first to educate your children, you are inoculating them for racism if you start this education at home. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking from the perspective of how do I not raise a child who will go march with neo-Nazis? How do I not raise a child who's like Amy Cooper in Central Park in New York? And that's your work in the home as a parent. Other recommendations are to always center BIPOC, so Black and people of color in anti-racism work, so and follow their lead and their preferences, and uplift Black and people of color as positive examples. Like I said, not Dr. Martin Luther King and other freedom fighters, and also contemporary scientists and politicians and children of color in the media. There are many examples, but you just have to go looking for them because they're not usually uplifted. And as parents, again, parents of children, by default, you are educating them at home and in school, and you can be an advocate for educational equity. And when you do that, make sure you look at the fine details, not just endorse, rhetoric that sounds good from leadership, and just look at the details. Are Black and POC students overrepresented in special education in your school or in your district, especially in self-contained classes where there's not enough adequate academic instruction? Are they underrepresenting in advanced learning or highly capable services? Dig deep, listen to the Black and POC parents who are the parents of those children who are least served. And whenever you're in doubt on how to proceed with your advocacy, make sure that you center the voices of those parents whose children are the most affected. Mm-hmm. Also, call out racism when you see it, especially like if it's physically safe to do so. And if not, think about alternative ways you can show up to support the victim and at least acknowledge the transgression afterwards. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And everyday decisions. Your children are the most amazing observers and investigators. They see everything we do and say in their presence, and they hear us.
Mm-hmm. we probably have a tremendous amount to learn from them in regards to their actions and their behaviors.
Yeah.
Coming from.
And make it specific. Like if you as the white parent are making a decision to, because we make everyday decisions that we think is not as impactful, but they are, especially cumulatively. So if you're making a conscious decision to support a business because it's Black owned or POC owned, tell your child that and tell them why you're making that decision as a parent. If you're donating to activists or an organization that does racial justice work like ours, or you volunteer for them, share that with your child. Let them know you're doing that and why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Christine, I have a couple of questions and comments coming in. A suggested resource came in from I think it's Jenny Peabody Rhodes. She said a book recommendation for white parents raising white children to be anti-racist, raising white kids, bringing up children in a racially unjust America by Jennifer Harvey. As you mentioned, Christine, conversations about race need to be happening throughout the childhood development. And this book has helped white parents start with work on themselves at home to be better allies and accomplices. Have you heard of that book?
I have not read it. We tend to focus on and recommend books for people who are parenting children of color.
Mm-hmm.
But I love to, if you can send me a message with the title of the book, I like to put it on my list and check it out later. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then here's a question. Can you talk about the specific challenges of mixed race families and what they're facing? This writer is a parent of color parent struggling to have conversations with white family members and white in-laws. What is the balance between my own self-care and having these conversations with white family members? She wants to protect her mixed race kids, but also want them to be able to have relationships with these white family members.
Thank you for that question. That did come up recently in our folks parenting community, and it's something that we want to address and support those parents. So we'll be talking we'll be talking as staff and see what's the best way to support those white parents who are in mixed in interracial relationships or marriages, because it can be really hard, especially if the white partner is not fully understanding of or supportive of racial justice efforts, and especially when you add the extended family and the dynamics. So it's hard. I just want to acknowledge that it's hard for the parent who submitted the question, and that there is no easy solution. And self-care is the most important thing you can do as a parent of color in an interracial family right now. You have to take care of yourself and protect your child. And if that means, I don't know to what extent these discussions are harming the child or the parent of color, but I would say you have to do what you have to do to protect your child from abuse and from racism, and that definitely can come from extended family. It also depends a lot on what the white partner is seeing as their role in kind of being a barrier to that conflict, right? The white partner should have to deal with the white family and be the protective parent to their child and the protective partner to their POC partner. Mm-hmm. So I recommend that parent, if they're not engaged with folks, to get engaged with folks. If you go to our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can also sign up for our folks parent groups, and we'll provide more resources and support in the next few days and more information.
Yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned parents need to focus on self-care. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Oh goodness, I'm a big proponent. I'm not the best follower, so for anyone who watches this and they know me, I can imagine they're wagging their finger at the screen because they know I'm not always following what I preach about self-care. But yes, it is important to do what it takes to stay healthy, stay sane, because if you're in a good space, that makes you more able to parent your child better. So I know parents who completely disengage from social media and from most interactions with people for 1 or 2 weeks after George Floyd died. It was so much messaging and so much for them emotionally to be able to handle that. Complete checking out was the best thing they could do for themselves. For many of our folks, parents, especially Black parents, that self-care was being in the grieving circles and the spaces that we created on Zoom for Black parents and parents of color, and just be there and be part of conversations with other parents who get it without the expectation of, okay, this is what we're going to do, or this is the solution, or this is how we're going to show up, and just be. And other self-care is, the usual, just have some time just for yourself, or you do something that's not on your to-do list, where you do something that's a hobby or really, really, heartwarming and good for you. And I know that you have some experience with mindfulness and, self-compassion, and I would love for our Black parents and parents of color to practice more of that, especially when they feel overwhelmed, they feel that they're not necessarily showing up in the way they would like to show up for their children. Just, be kind to yourselves. These are such difficult times, and be kind to yourself. You're doing the best you can, and you are your kids' heroes. That's how they see you.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I think within community mindful parenting, we would say the same thing. I mean, beyond making sure your basic needs are met, sleep, food, hydration, I mean, those are foundational, right? In the hierarchy of things, but also just breathing, right? Taking some pauses and breaths, and to kind of tapping into that inner wisdom of you as an individual and as a parent, and that you have tremendous strength and resilience, which is something that is needed right now. So to be able to, I mean, this is sitting with these hard feelings, and using that as that source of strength. That's what we call self-compassion in the community mindful parenting world. It's an action. It's something you do when you're feeling that sense of overwhelm. Yeah. And I know that we're working with Families of Color Seattle to bring some more mindfulness opportunities. So that'll be a nice overlap.
That would be great.
So how do you recommend that school communities, neighborhood associations, employers, and other groups provide spaces for much needed conversations on racism?
Yeah, we've definitely seen an increase of that, and that's really great. My number one recommendation is to make sure that that those spaces that you're providing as a positive resource and positive benefit for your employees or community members are the right spaces. And the number one is making sure that there's a culturally competent facilitator, and that people are participating with very clear expectations. I mentioned before about that metaphor, kindergarten versus fifth grade, and that's so important, which is why in our workshops and spaces we do provide affinity groups, because it can be re-traumatizing for Black parents to be part of an affinity group where white people are showing up expressing dismay or, you know, questioning. That's not what should be about. If there are people at that stage, there should be a space for them where they get to process that, and there's a facilitator around that. But if you're providing services or, you know, spaces that incorporate and welcome and center your Black and POC community members, you have to make sure that their needs are met. One thing that I really hope, like related to that, that's, if you've heard of the ring theory of the centers of grief, that's kind of the model for this as well. As outraged as everyone is and hurt and traumatized, just remember that Black parents are in the middle of that, like they're the closest circle. And then other, you know, brown parents, and then, you know, white people parenting Black and brown kids, and then white parents of white kids. So just keep that ring theory and centers of grief in mind whenever you put together such and open such a space to your community. And I wish I didn't have to stress this, but I see this happen all the time in online circles and in, well, we're not having face-to-face discussions now, but I saw this happen over and over. And I recommend that you have a very clear way to avoid centering detractors. Do not allow them to take the stage or the agenda. I can't stress this enough. There's just so much energy. And I saw this in an online space that's a community group where there was a recent news coverage locally about a 7-year-old Black girl who was brutalized in school, and her cries were similar to that of George Floyd, saying she couldn't breathe. She had, you know, reportedly, the security guard had his arm against her neck and elbow in the back and like constrained her, and the girl was in pain. And there was discussion about this coverage, and so much of that, so much energy went into trying to convince one white woman who kept alleging that the story is fake news. Why did they have to say the girl is Black? Why did they have to say I can't breathe? They're after something. And so many people were chiming in and trying to convince this woman that the story is real and this is happening. And it's so frustrating to watch, because if all that energy went instead into action, you know, into writing to the people in public office, or like doing something as a community to send the message that this is not okay, and you want your public officials to behave better, and you want to prevent this from happening again. And instead it went into basically dealing with that detractor. So don't allow that to happen. That's my recommendation.
Does your organization provide some scaffolding resources for that if somebody feels compelled right now to create that space in their community? What you're saying is really important, but not everybody will necessarily be able to confidently do that without having you know, those pieces. Does Families of Color Seattle, is there something on your website or something that can be used? Or I know you also offer some consulting kind of opportunities.
Yeah, we do have, we do systems change work, which is like we do trainings and workshops, and there are other people in the community who also can facilitate discussions. And that's why I mentioned the most important, the number one thing on the list is having a culturally competent, informed, educated facilitator for these discussions, and have a very clear purpose. What is the goal? Is the goal to educate, to inform people? Is the goal to come together as a community? Is the goal to have some action items at the end? Yeah, make that very clear, and do not like set the ground rules. We actually had to do that in our own community several years ago when we had parents come to our events, and again, we define families of color as any family that has Black and brown kids, kids of color. And we had parents who would come in and question the idea of white privilege, or that there's still racism in the world. And we had to just have a policy say, if you're coming to our folks parent groups or event, by default, you're checking this box that this is what folks is about, that we're not debating whether white privilege exists, we're not debating whether racism is real. And this is like how you show up into the space. Because if you have, you know, if you have people showing up not like already questioning or not believing or starting from or being there just to create, just to detract, and maybe their agenda is to not allow you to get to the goals that you have set, you have to have a policy in place on how to deal with such detractors.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's really helpful. It's hard to believe, but we are the end of our hour here. Thank you, ParentMap. I want to send this back over to Elaine to close us out.
Well, I mean, first of all, I cannot thank both of you enough. Christine, you offered so much insight and wisdom for all of us individually and as an audience. And thank you also, Deb. The conversation is just beginning, and being the pathological optimist, I appreciate how challenging the discussions are, but the opportunity for each individual, family, you know, the community, and for organizations to move to a completely different place over time with some of the great work that you're doing and Families of Color Seattle is doing, Christine, is essential, just essential. So thank you. I want to thank our sponsors again. And I really urge people, I'm going to hold up with my, I'm going to urge people to invest in Families of Color Seattle and really jump on and support this great work. And check ParentMap.com live out tomorrow, where we have Love in Time of the Coronavirus featuring Gottman certified therapist Zach Brittle. And I'll just leave it at that and say thank you both again.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Elaine. And thank you, the ParentMap community.
Yeah, thank you.
We're here for you.
Thank you.